project. In this video, I'm going to show you how to make this shelf using only traditional joinery, glue and joinery, no screws, no nails. And I would argue this project is about as easy as putting this same bookshelf together with pocket hole screws and plywood. But to me, it's a lot more fun and didn't take that much longer, honestly. And I think the skills you learn doing something like this are going to be put to better use making quality furniture in the future. I used basically the exact same joinery techniques to make this record player stand that I have, and I love that. That was one of the earlier projects I made. I'm really proud of that, and it's basically the same thing here. And a project like this using pine would be a great way to practice that exact thing. I do think this is a reasonable project for a beginner woodworker. I've only been doing this for a year myself, but there are actually kind of a lot of steps. So I'm going to make this a two-part video. In the first part, I'll show you all the tools that you're going to need to do this, and we'll cover cutting the mortises, which are these holes for the shelves, and then the tenons, which are the parts of the shelves that fit into the holes. That'll be part one. In part two, I'll cover how to cut the dovetails for the tops and the bottoms, as well as gluing it up and putting in all the finishing touches. So the other thing I really like about this project is a lot of those videos that are like, easy, pocket hole screws and plywood project, easy project, then they bust out a table saw, they bust out a $400 track saw. I'm going to use only cheap tools in this project, or mostly cheap tools. So what do you actually need? You need an orbital sander. That's pretty central to any type of woodworking, I would say. You need some type of 1/2-inch bit. You can either use a spade bit, or I have a nicer auger bit that I use. An adjustable square, so you can measure out your joinery. Again, pretty central tool. Some sort of knife to mark your lines. I just use this cheap knife, although a nice marking knife would probably work better. You do need a saw, but you don't need a table saw. I do just about everything in this video with this, or you could do everything in this video with this $40 Ryoba saw. It's a really nice saw. Some sort of mallet for whacking your chisels. I made this one, but you can buy them. You can also just use a hammer. If you don't have one yet, it'll be a little rough on your chisels, but if you have cheap chisels, it also won't really matter. Some sort of 3/4 inch chisel that is sharp, preferably. Pencil. You need some sort of drill. So either an electric drill will work fine. This is really, I feel like pretty much everybody should have one of these, especially if you're a homeowner, you probably should have a drill. But I also like to use a bit and brace. I got this one for about $10 at a flea market, or at an antique store. And you do have to look a little bit for one that actually has jaws that will grab modern hex bits. This one does really well. I have another one that doesn't. But that's pretty much everything you're gonna need. Well, actually, you also need some type of clamps. I like pipe clamps. They're probably the cheapest, not the cheapest option, but the cheapest option that's really good. If you go to Lowe's or Home Depot, they'll cut black pipe for you, although I would suggest going when they're not super busy. 2 different lengths for your pipe clamps. You might be able to get away with doing this project with just a couple of ratchet straps, and I do think the ratchet straps are really helpful for this, so suggest that. You also need some sort of surface, some sort of table to work on, preferably a sturdy one. But I've done projects on fold-out tables that are wobbly. It's not easy, it's annoying, but it does work if that's all you have. Some sort of vise to hold your wood while you're sawing it would be, again, ideal, although you can probably get away with some clamps and a table to do a lot of the same thing. Now, optional tools. I use this jigsaw to speed things up. Don't use a lot of power tools, but this speeds this process up, and you can get one for like $30. I like this Katz Moses dovetail jig. It's a dovetail jig that also has what you do need for dovetails, a straight vertical cut, and yeah, it just makes sawing nice, precise lines a lot easier. It means I'm not as good at freehanding it, but I use this a lot, and then it turns out nice. Another optional marking tool is a marking gauge. You can do a lot of the same thing with this if you're kind of careful and you hold it and you hold your knife or whatever, but these are just really handy for marking out joinery. I suggest getting one of these. I like the round ones, but they make more traditional looking ones like this that work too. A fret saw or a coping saw. I use it for the dovetails. You can get away with not having one. And a plane. I don't actually use the plane that much here, and any like rounding off of corners you could do with sandpaper too. Mostly where you see me use this is in combination with this, which is a shooting board, to really square up the ends of my boards. Hand cutting a perfectly straight line, especially across 12-inch board, is not the easiest thing in the world. I'm not that great at it, and so this just helps me make those cuts really square. It's not necessary for this to work. It's just going to make it look a little bit nicer. But you can also just take your time, be really careful with that cut. Or if you already do have some power tools, you have a circular saw or a chop saw or something, and you can just get square cuts with that, then you know, this is a lot of different things, but none of them are that expensive. You could probably get all this stuff for the same price as a nice table saw.
I'm not trying to be a snobby woodworker or disrespect pocket holes in plywood. If that's your thing, that's awesome. You can make really nice looking projects that way. I just really enjoy the look of joinery, and I like making something I know I couldn't buy. Now, before you excitedly run out and buy wood, you need to make a plan. I recommend working backwards. Draw out the height, width, and number of shelves you need. Then from that, you can determine the final length boards you'll need for the shelves and the sides. That's your cut list. Then from there, you can figure out what full lengths you can cut those from that will waste the least and still fit in your car. The next step is to cut all these long boards you just bought to the size that is going to match your cut list. Don't forget the shelves will have tenons that go through the sides, so their length will be whatever you want the width of your entire case to be, not just the inside portion. The ideal outcome here is to get all those horizontal pieces, your shelves and the top and the bottom, to be the same length and to have all of your cuts be square. A shooting board is the best way to do this with hand tools, which is what I'm going to use. But if you don't have that, mark a knife line, be sure to cut on the waist side of that line. And honestly, I'm not that great at this, so I'll link some videos down below to people who are. Some of my cuts got pretty wonky. Now we can fix that with the shooting board, but once you have them all square, you want to also make sure that they're the same length. So I just hold them up to my plane and I feel for the shortest one. Then once I have the shortest one, I just plane all the other ones until they're equal. Now it's time to mark out the mortises. That's the holes in the sides. Eventually, you're going to want to do this with a knife, but to avoid cutting a bunch of extra marks in your shelf, I start by sketching the shelf positions with pencil. My shelves are 11 inches apart, so I mark those as well as 3/4 of an inch above that so I can see exactly where my shelf fits in. I could just do this again for the second side. Instead, I lined them up and continued that line onto the second piece, so I only had to measure once. You want this to be close, but don't worry about making these pencil lines super precise. We're gonna have that precision when we come back with the knife lines. Now you also want marks on the other side, so transfer those pencil lines onto the edge of your board, then flip it over and use that mark as a reference to put lines on the other side. Now that we have the pencil guides, we can start with the knife lines that will actually define our mortise. Set your marking gauge or adjustable square. We're just doing one mortise right in the middle, and I wanted about a 3-inch mortise, and my boards are about 11 1/4 inch wide, so I set my gauge to a little over 4 inches.
So the important thing then with the vertical parts of our mortises isn't so much that our shelves are exactly however far apart, 11 inches apart. That's not super important. What is important is we want the two sides to be the same, to be level, and you want them to be 3/4 of an inch thick so that you know your tenon is not sloppy in there. So I do not know the best way to do this, but what I'm gonna do is secure this one down and butt them up against each other so that I can get the shelves level with each other to start. And so I will strike my knife line here about where my line is, and I can see kind of the start and end of it now because I went a little bit past with my vertical knife lines. And I'm just going to do a little tick because it's more precise. I'm going to do a little tick on the end of my other board there. I'll show you how to line up to that later. Okay, so now we want to make sure that we're actually 3/4 of an inch up from that. And what I'm going to do is use my 3/4 of an inch chisel, or you could use a piece of wood and knock it up against there. But what I think I'm going to do is do this and just give it a press. And there. Now I can see the other end, and I can buck my knife right up against there and do that. The next thing I would do is what I always do is you want to mark what you're going to take out, which is this. So
Now you can see how I'm using those tick marks I made on the end of the other board. Put your knife in the tick mark, buck your square up to the knife, and then make your mark. Once again, using my chisel to get those 3/4 of an inch differences, and you can see this goes pretty quick. So to make these precise, you want to put your knife in the mortise line you've already made, and put your square against that. Then put a tick on the edge. Then put your knife in that tick and use that as a reference for striking a line down the side. Then flip your board over and use that mark on the side to set your square up to mark the mortise on the other side. If you're worried about knife lines on your edges, just don't make those gouges too deep and you should be able to sand it out, no problem. It's important to mark both sides because if you try to chisel all the way through from one side, you'll get a lot of chipping and blowout on the back side, and it's also going to be tough to chisel at a perfect 90-degree angle. Now that you have them totally marked, it's time to cut them out. To start, we're going to drill out part of the hole. If you have a jigsaw, just put 1 or 2 holes in the ends to get you started. If you want to stick to all hand tools, you can also drill holes all along the mortises to get out a majority of the waste wood. I'm using a 1/2 inch bit because you want to stay clear of those knife lines you've made. Now with the jigsaw, the goal is to get close, but still stay clear of those knife lines. It's not precise enough to cut on the line. The goal here is to just get the bulk out to minimize the time with the chisel work. This is actually my first time using the jigsaw for this, and it certainly sped things up, but it's far from necessary. You should probably also wear a dust mask when using power tools, but I don't do that much, and so I forgot. Now you just want to pare down to that knife line with the chisel. The knife line is great because you can actually feel the chisel fit into the line. I also recommend making those lines nice and deep on pine. Pine is cheap, which makes it really nice for beginner projects, but it's actually less forgiving of dull tools and tends to chip and crack more than hardwoods. But I found with really deep knife lines, it often breaks right on that line anyway. Keep in mind, you're not trying to go clear to the other side. Shoot for about halfway down. That way, when you flip the board over and come from the other side, it'll be totally cleared out. Now here I am coming from the other side. This wood is going to be less supported now since you've chiseled out the other side, and it's going to break and chip even more, and that's where that deep knife line is going to really come in handy. If you keep a little scrap of 3/4 inch wood handy, you can test your fit as you go. Now that we have the mortises done, we can start marking out the tenons. First, we need to mark the depth of the tenons. They're going through a 3/4 inch board, so they need to be at least 3/4 of an inch, but I recommend going longer than that. I think I did like a full inch. It's better for them to be too long because then you can just cut them off with your Ryoba saw and sand them flush with the outside. The most important thing here though is that they're all the same on all your shelves. So set your marking gauge and mark all of your shelves at the same time. If you have an exact width you want for your shelf, you will want to take into account that extra bit you're cutting off when you cut your shelves to length so that you end up with the final width that you wanted. Go ahead and mark the top and bottom as well, even though we're doing dovetails there. You want the depth of the cut on those to match the shelves so everything is the exact same width.
All right, so the next thing we want to do is measure the depths of these tenons. Now we want to measure the width, and we want that width to match our mortises. So we could measure, and I could measure it out and mark it there. What I'm going to do, because I don't like measuring things, I'm not very good at it, is I'm going to just use the hole that I already have for my marking gauge and set my marking gauge on that hole. You'll see, since I use the same gauge for everything else, that should be pretty close for all of these. It shouldn't really matter which one I pick. If you don't have one of these, you do the same thing with this. And then just mark on the end of that with a knife or a pencil. Then what I'm going to do, take each one of these boards and mark the width.
Now we're ready to cut them out. It's important here to cut on the outside of your line. That's the waist side. Your saw cut does actually take up space, so if you cut right on the line, you're going to have gaps. Now, I'm not that great at sawing. I use that jig a lot, but I did try freehanding it here. The best trick I found is to look at the reflection of the wood in your saw plate. It should look like that reflection kind of keeps going straight. That's the best way I know how to describe it. Look at your saw, move it around so that it's not straight, and you'll see what I mean. The other thing I did here is move my board farther down in the vise. It was high enough up that it was kind of wobbling back and forth, which was making sawing a little bit harder, and moving it down did help some. Now it's time to cut the sides. The advantage of doing one tenon in the middle is that if you do this cut well, you won't have to do any chiseling. Once again, you want to make sure you cut on the waist side of that line. If you want it to look really nice or you don't trust your sawing, you can cut farther away from the line and then pare down from the knife line with a chisel. Now I said no chiseling. You might have to clean up the corner of that cut a little bit, but that does not take long at all. You can test the fit right off the saw. Ideally, it goes in and it's snug. If it doesn't, you might have to trim down the edges of those tenons a bit. And that's it for part one. And really, you could glue this up and be done. If those sides were a bit shorter on the top, I think this would look pretty nice. I wanted that full square look, so in part two, I'll move on to cutting the dovetails on the top and the bottom. I know this is cringy, but if you did enjoy the video, please like and subscribe. Making this was a lot of fun, honestly, but it'll be a little more fun if someone other than my mom is watching.